But I converted to Islam in '92, and from that day forward, I was very deeply involved in the Muslim community. And I just was gone for 13 and a half years. That's why these people now who are coming up and, who've been, it's funny to say coming up, but I mean, they haven't heard of me. But when I got out, I was like, oh, okay, Muslims, let's see what's happening with the community, because I was really out of touch. And then I didn't really know how to access that. And I'm like, oh, okay, Facebook, Twitter, and then I get on there and I'm like, what is going on? I just didn't even recognize, I barely recognized, the community as a result of but then I started trying to figure out well, how did it was like I had gotten in a time machine, and I was like, how did we get here from there? And so, I mean, that might be, what we were talking about the, some of the delusions of, or the illusions of progressivism and so on play a big role in that. I know you guys are in Australia, so maybe it's not as pertinent to you guys about Islam in America, but you probably have a lot of American listeners,
yeah,
as well.
It's a bit interesting. Actually, we started recording, by the way. Are you cool with that? I've got some things to add to you.
Oh, yeah. Well, why don't you guys do an introduction, and then I can fill in.
Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back to another episode of Boys in the Cave. My name is Tanzim, and I'm joined by my co-host Rafael. Alhamdulillah, we're joined by someone very special today. Ismail Royer is a director of Islam and Religious Freedom Action Team at the Religious Freedom Institute, a non-for-profit organization based in Washington, D.C. He's also worked with CAIR from 1994 to 2001. And his writings has appeared in publications such as Washington Post, Journal of Religion and Society, Public Discourse, Detroit Free Press, Al-Jumuah, and Muslim Matters. And you'd be seeing him online as well. He's posting a lot and doing a lot of good works online on social media as well. So, assalamu alaikum, Ismail Royer, and welcome to Boys in the Cave.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
You were actually touching on, just before I gave you the introduction, about not knowing what the society was like and what the community was doing. It was like, in comparison to Australia, it's a bit difficult to relate in the sense that we find that we, as a Muslim community, we're sort of bombarded with the discourse that happens in America specifically that might be more relevant to the American content specifically, but doesn't relate to the Australian context.
It's quite different. A lot of people we have who come from the Australian context, a lot of tulab and shuyukh even, who travel from Australia to America, they come back scratching their heads, to say the least, as to what
that makes two of us, because I'm also scratching my head.
Like, we find that let's just bring up as an example, like, feminism is like a big thing in America. Everyone wants to fight it and be against it. I've got my own opinions about it, but I've realized why American Muslims are more privy to being, very anti-feminist is because of, you start seeing a lot of progressive liberal Muslims, and it's like the Muslim community are bombarded with the thought, oh, that's what I gather from what I see online.
Also, the LGBT movement as well.
Yeah, it seems like it's massive in America, but here in Australia, locally, I have never encountered such a thing ever.
Not the kind of fervent.
It's either, from my experience, it's either you have, there will be maybe factions in the community, right? But they're pretty much non-existent. They don't have any sort of power in that sense to make a statement on an organizational level. So that's why we don't have to really go down the anti-feminist discourse at all, per se.
It's not so much a part of a bastion of our kind of community discussions. Yeah. But one thing I want to ask you is, was that the case in America in the early 90s, or is this a more recent kind of development with the imposition of these progressive movements on the Muslim community?
Yeah, I mean, definitely more recent. So when I became Muslim in 1992 in St. Louis, this stuff was really totally unheard of. There were a few there were a few glimmers of this sort of thing, Islamic feminism. That's a term and a concept that has been around for a long time. The idea that feminism and Islam are compatible, and that the feminist movement and ideology can help to, let's say, not only is not incompatible with Islam, but also could help to rectify some of the mistakes or some of the errors, un-Islamic errors that had crept into Islamic culture, and so that was something that doesn't actually sound crazy, for a person, for example, like myself, I was fairly liberal before I converted, and it doesn't sound crazy on its face if one doesn't really know what the ideology of feminism is, and so on. And so I remember, for example, attending a lecture at the Muslim Arab Youth Association, which was that's a whole different can of worms there. But in 1993, I think, and Hamza Yusuf spoke at it, and he warned people against Fatima Mernissi. Fatima Mernissi was she's a Moroccan writer, an early writer on this concept of Islamic feminism, and he warned people and said, "Don't listen to this woman. Husbands, keep her away. Keep her books away from your wives. She's poisonous." And so that was really an interesting thing to me, and I took note of that, and I still remember it to this day. But this was, of course, Fatima Mernissi is heavily promoted among sort of Islamic feminist circles as a pioneer in this field, and at that time that was like an outlier. I mean, that really, Muslims weren't really interested in that type of stuff. Mostly Muslims were interested in, as far as, we're talking about practicing Muslims. We're not talking about the sort of, or the less practicing and more just culturally oriented Muslims. But we're talking about the people who are going to the masajid, identifying themselves as Muslims, active in the Muslim community, active in the masjid. Most of these people, most of the women were not, and on campuses in the MSAs, the Muslim Students Associations, and so on. The major organization like Islamic Society of North America, ISNA, you just didn't see this coming up a lot, and then, so not only that as well, but here's where I think the problem happened. The problem happened, as you mentioned, I started working at CAIR in 1994. There was something about the approach, and about the approach that eventually, as the years went on, made me uncomfortable of constantly looking, constantly identifying Muslims with being bullied and with being victimized. And it's very, very understandable why that was done. I mean, it's the language of the civil rights discourse. And, it became a way, not only certainly not just for Muslims. Everyone, even white folks, Christians, many people have adopted this discourse, this rights discourse, and this victimhood discourse as a means of asserting rights and so on. But the problem is that I was recognizing even back then, to the extent that by 2002, I had written a couple essays that made some people angry in the field that I was working in, the Islamic activist field, where I was warning about this victimhood complex and this victimhood mentality. It just seemed undignified to me. Look, I converted to Islam. I didn't, and I don't mean any disrespect at all, but I didn't. My parents didn't come to this country. My parents were born here. My ancestors, Johann Royer came in 1743 on a boat from Germany. So, I don't have any sort of complex about whether I belong here and whether I'm an actual American, because I am an American, and there's nothing anyone. It's so normal and natural to me that I don't have any complex about it, and I really do strongly feel that so much of the strange positions of many Muslims today is due to their due to complexes over having not feeling secure in their place as being Americans, and we can unpack that a little bit more. I kind of jumped there.
No,
but,
I certainly have the same experience as you. My dad's Italian, like first generation, and my mum's side, however, have been in Australia since 1825. My ancestors came out from Ireland, and I certainly have never had that kind of debate as that kind of internal conflict as to whether I'm Australian or not. I've always considered myself Australian.
Yeah.
Like the way I speak is something unavoidable. The fact that my ancestors have been here so long and that I have family for generations and history for generations in this country means that I am, in definitely kind of determined upon this path of having this distinct and pretty much sole identity. It's really interesting though that you mentioned in relation to the American discussion, because one thing I was thinking about when you were talking was the fact that I think something like a third of all American Muslims are actually African American of convert descent. So how does that sort of play into the discussions and that what you've just mentioned in terms of identity?
Well, this is critically important because, first of all, whether we want to admit it or not, it's very much the case that the immigrant Muslim community has, let's say, superseded, I guess, superseded to a great extent the voices of the African American converts or descendants of converts. So indigenous African American Muslim community. And I say that not to stir up any trouble or to cast any blame or anything like that, but it's just that when you think of Muslims in America, it's very much associated with Arab, South Asian, and that sort of thing, and you just don't hear very much from from African Americans. And I will tell you that African American Muslims, by and large, are not by any means affected by the same complex. Which and let me explain what I mean by this, by a complex over being an immigrant. I believe, in my observation, this is my observation, I believe that when you have the first generation, they really don't care very much. They're not some of them, some, but generally speaking, and I'm just speaking in generalities, they're not that concerned with whether or not people like them or not. They're mainly concerned with getting along. They feel their identity is that they're very comfortable in being Pakistani and being Indian and being Palestinian and being Arab or whatever, so they're very comfortable with that. And then the problem, I believe, what we're seeing today has really come about due to second generation people, because this generation doesn't really fit very well, or in their minds, they don't fit very well in white society. Certainly don't have too much of a concern about fitting into African American society. That's not really their interest. And again, I'm not saying this in any accusatory way. I'm just saying that this is the reality. And at the same time, they don't exactly feel Pakistani, and they don't know what that means to be. I think they don't necessarily feel authentically connected to the old world in the same sense as their parents did. And so it leaves them in a sort of state of limbo to where they're very, very, very sensitive to any suggestion that they don't fit. And as a result of that, they seem to be craving acceptance, craving affirmation. And by the way, I really have to stress, I do not mean in any way to be insulting by this. I'm just discussing a normal human reaction. And so for that reason, you often have very, very misunderstood concepts of what it means to be an American. You don't actually have to be white to be an American, regardless of if you encounter racism, or you encounter anti-Muslim sentiment from white folks, or some white folks, or even all white folks. Ask African Americans. African Americans are are just as American as any white person, and likewise Native Americans, and likewise Hispanics.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, yeah, I mean, these people feel American, but it's and they don't have any real desire whatsoever to fit in or not fit in, because they already do fit in. And so that's why I think that you see this desire, this push to the left, to the progressive left, because the progressive left has been so embracing of Muslims as an identity group, as a group that is yet another one of these ethnic brown identity groups. And again, the left almost always, you'll see them categorize Muslims as part of the South Asian and Arab, sort of collective group, and without making any reference whatsoever to beliefs. And that's the thing, is that they've hollowed out Islam. They've hollowed out Islam, and they've said, we will accept you so long as you don't live those beliefs and you don't speak about those beliefs. And it's a trade-off. It's a trade-off that you get. And very, very importantly to notice that it's the problem is that the whole entire American society is secularizing. Faith is something that is being slowly bled out of our country and out of our culture. And so these kids that are being raised, in this society, it's not a society that is conducive to faith at all in any event. And then we have the issues, which I won't get into, of Islamic schools, which are by and large failing the children, burning kids out on Islam. I've seen that with my own family, and so it's not hard to understand why they would second generation would go towards the side of the people who are accepting them and giving them flattering words, and away from what they perceive as hostility, skepticism, and so on.
I think the point you're touching upon reminds me of one of the great legacies of Professor Tariq Ramadan in France, and his kind of activism there, which was, I know he's got all the difficulties surrounding his, what's happened to him lately, but one of the great legacies and one of the main points that he tried to instill in European society was that Islam is now native to the West. It's no longer a foreign kind of import that is going to remain forever on the fringes of society. Like there are Muslims who are now second, third, fourth, and even native, like you mentioned in America with the indigenous African American communities, and even the indigenous converts themselves, and Latinos who are now, according to some reports, converting to Islam in quite high numbers.
Oh yeah.
So they're native to the country, and so as soon as I wonder, how important do you think it is that even second and third generation Muslims start to consider themselves as native to the country that they find themselves born in? And just kind of related to that, extremism amongst the second generation. We have a problem, not so much as a problem as the media likes to portray it, with second generation Lebanese Australians and Arab Australians and various other ethnic groups. Only I mention Lebanese because they're by far the largest apparent Muslim community in our area. But the problems are always...
I've met Lebanese people overseas and with extremist groups.
But second,
Lebanese Australians.
The problems are almost exclusively with the second generation. And very rarely with the first. In fact, almost never with the first in terms of inclination towards violent extremist groups. So this kind of identity, the discussion of identity, how important is the idea of Islam being a native, like us being, truly part of this society, and our religion being part of this society? How important is that kind of discussion? And also, how influential is this discussion on the emergence of violent extremist tendencies?
So there's a lot that you just said there, and a lot of fruitful ground for discussion. So I think, first of all, I think that there's something different about America, England, Australia than potentially New Zealand, I guess, in a way. With these, the Anglo-American world, as opposed to France. I don't think Tariq Ramadan is correct in this situation, because first of all, France, France as a polity, you can't be. I mean, I'm just going to say you can't be Arab and French. You can't be Arab and French. I just don't believe that makes any sense in the French, or just like you can't be German and a Turk. I just don't think that makes any sense. Why? Because these polities are ethnic nation states, and they are defined by ethnicity. They're defined by language, and they're defined by borders. And this is a very modern, contemporary concept, but I don't think that it is really. I think that there's to be a non-Frenchman in France, ethnic Frenchman is always going to be and is going to involve tension. I just don't think that that's resolvable on any fundamental level, much less to be a religious person. You can't even be Catholic, a practicing Catholic, and be an authentic Frenchman today, because France is based on the concept of France as a concept is based on the idea that religion is the enemy, and that religion should not be practiced in public. It only belongs in private. And so someone will say, "Oh, that's reductive, or you're overstating it." No, I'm really not. I mean, if people understand what the concept is behind laïcité and so on, so you just cannot live as a religious person in France in the way that is necessary for human flourishing. I mean, it's just anti-human. Now, add to that being a Muslim religious Arab, for example, in France. Now, so I think that all that just doesn't add up. And likewise in Germany, and I think that this has a lot to do, not entirely, but it has a lot to do with why there's much less. There's a concept, this assimilation and so on that's being talked about in France. And then, so how are we going to do that? We're going to have to prevent people from wearing hijab, or we're going to have to put crosses in classrooms like in Germany. And they're not, by the way, these crosses are not even religious crosses. They are making clear. In Bavaria, for example, there was some push to put crosses up in classrooms to establish German identity, but they're not there for religious reasons. They're making it very clear this is here because it's a cultural thing. So there you see that they've bled religion out of it altogether, and it's only ethnic, and it's only So I don't think that makes any sense, to be honest. I just don't know how to solve that, and maybe just to move. I mean, I know that doesn't make sense, but I mean that's not very practical. But it's either that or just suffer. I think when it comes to England and America, it's a very different situation because, and especially America, because America and possibly Australia, but America is just not based on an ethnicity. America is based on an idea. And I'm not saying that as some sort of some sort of patriotic nonsense. And yes, there's racism, and yes, but it cannot be denied. It simply cannot be denied that the African American is just as American as any white person. And likewise, the Hispanic, even the Hispanic that just comes from Mexico, a year ago, they're actually American, even if they don't have American, even if they're illegal aliens, because the whole entire south of the United States was Mexico at some point. So there's this strange, there's this, and it's also Mexico is also North America. So there's this very interesting dynamic going on, and so to be American is a different thing. To be American means to agree that we're all going to live here together and not impose our religions on one another, and we're going to work together for the common good. And yet, at the same time, we all agree to allow one another to practice our religions in peace and to live our religions in public. Now, to the extent that does not always happen, and it certainly has not happened throughout history, there's still nevertheless recourse to saying, okay, this is the covenant, or this is the agreement that we agreed upon or that was agreed upon in 1780, whatever it was that they ratified the Constitution. So there's always recourse to some statement about what our agreement is. That we hold on. It's like, hold on, okay, you're telling me that my wife can't wear niqab, for example. It's not me personally, what I'm saying. And walk down the street. Well, the First Amendment says this, and that's what So that Constitution and the there's a philosophy behind it. This isn't just words, and it's based on something. And once what is it based on? It's based on belief in God, and the United States Constitution is based on belief in God, and the Declaration of Independence is based on belief in God, and it's rooted in the transcendent. Whereas France, the concept of France, the concept of the ethno-state, these are all rooted in nothing. Frankly, they're just rooted in some ideas that some people had, which leaves it very unstable and not rooted in anything. So I went on that long tirade to say that in America, really, as long as you agree to live your life and not bother other people and so on, then you can be accepted as American. And this has happened throughout history. The Japanese have been I don't say similar, that's not the right word, but they have, the Polish and the Italians and African Americans and so on and so on. So I believe that our prospects for Islam being a native religion are much different in America because it was not founded on an ethno-state basis. It is very, very important that Muslims see themselves as being American, not American in the sense of accepting everything that the American government does, or accepting everything that happens in America as good. That's not what it means. What it means is seeing ourselves as part and parcel of the landscape, and seeing Islam as something that is naturally that can naturally be practiced here. And because really we can practice our religion here. There's nothing. The only thing that we really can't do here is say, like, have 4 wives, as a legally recognized sort of marriage. There are some things that are encroaching on that. So, for example, it's starting to be, you're going to be required. It's going to be discrimination. You can lose your business if you don't serve. If you don't say, for example, rent your apartment out to a gay couple. Then there are laws in the works that would make it illegal to do that, and there are state laws that would make it illegal to do that. So there are some ways in which one might be forced to violate one's religion, but generally not. So without that understanding, then there's always going to be this cognitive dissonance where we're going to be either seeking approval, seeking acceptance, or despairing of getting acceptance, which is the other side of the coin. And in that despair, rebelling, and in that and that despair becomes resentment, and the resentment can become violent. So I think that is why I think because Muslims in Europe in Western Europe, and especially in these places that are profoundly secular and militantly secular, I think it's just, and because they can't assimilate non-whites, I just think that it's that's why they're having these problems. They're basically faced with the choice of self-annihilation, or and I just don't think that that's feasible, and it points again to the unworkability and the inhumanity of the ethnic nation state.
I wanted to ask a question. It might be digressing a little bit, but because you mentioned the Constitution, you touched on secularism, all that sort of stuff, and compared it to France, for example. The concept of, I guess, secularism, it's kind of new because back in the days it was more so centered on, I don't know, culture, or in terms of religion, and Islamic histories, an example of that. But in terms of secularism as an idea, right? What I've looked into, like the thinkers of who came up with the idea of secularism and kind of implemented it, or kind of facilitated the discourse of secularism. The people like, I think it's John Locke, all those sort of thinkers. From my limited studies, I actually looked a bit into that, but then I realized I think he had a teacher called Edward Pocock, and he actually was very well acquainted with the Muslims, and he actually one of them, I think Edward Pocock or someone else, that actually traveled to the Muslim lands, actually, had an understanding of Islam. And I guess that's where he came up with ideas. I'm not too sure how it kind of panned out for him, but I know he had a very deep connection with the Muslim world. He actually sat with scholars apparently as well. So, and that's how I guess he formed his own ideas and passed them on to, John Locke, and then it flow-on effect, and, those ideas get instilled. But I was having a discussion with a friend. It's just the idea about secularism, liberalism in general, that's kind of embedded into the society we live. I was having a discussion with him how nations exist now. So we have, America's very powerful. Obviously, it's got its military, its society. It's very strong. It has a lot of power over the world at this point in time. And we were kind of discussing why that's the case. A lot of people like to see it as, like when they read politics, they like to read it with the lens that there's people who conquered, and America just has a lot of power because of its military might, and that's why it's able to sustain its society, all these sort of reasonings, right? But I came from the perspective of education and ideas, the fact that the society actually has taken on nationalism, secularism as like a default, like an axiom almost, to the point like you're born, you go to high school, you go to schooling system. You just have to, like it's better if the society is more secular. What I'm just talking about is just the realm of ideas and how they influence masses. Where would you say that sort of builds from? Do you think like it's a flow-on effect? Does it come up from a vacuum? Is it kind of passed down? Because we see, if you look through, philosophy over time, it changes, especially when it's intertwined with politics, right? So where do you think it kind of originates from? Why it comes to such a position in time? Why, as the masses think in a certain way at this point in time when it comes to these sort of ideas?
So there's, I think, let's say broadly, three things categories we could talk about. First of all, we could talk about what was the relationship between religion, religious scholars, and so on, and the governmental authorities in the Islamic empires, the Islamic polities, and for that matter, even Christian polities in pre-modern times. And then we can talk about quote unquote secularism in the United States and England, and we could talk about secularism in continental Europe. And these are actually all three different things, because first of all, let's talk about the Islamic polities, pre-modern Islamic polities. Contrary to what many people think, there was actually a fairly defined role for Islamic scholars that did not involve the government. As a matter of fact, they tended to, especially in the era after the Khulafa Rashidun, the four or five, if you want to add Hassan radiallahu anh, during that time, yes, the ruler during the first generation, the rulers were actually Sahaba, but after that, and after Umar ibn Abdul Aziz and so on, there tended to be a separation. The Islamic, the ulama, the Islamic scholars avoided government altogether, and their role was essentially as a moral sort of check on governmental authority, and the governmental authority had some broad parameters in which they could operate, and if they went beyond that, then the ulama would check them, and the ulama were often consulted by rulers if the rulers were pious people who cared about the views of people of knowledge, of Islamic knowledge. But, we didn't have a situation like Wilayat al-Faqih or something like what Khomeini imagined with fuqaha, ulama running the government. And so of course it's true that with that the ulama had and the qadis and so on had a sort of judicial function when it came to penal code, when it came to civil, not, and even there, see, I just said the word code. There was no code, but the penal system, or and likewise the civil sort of like issues related to lawsuits and related to inheritance, but there was no so one could look at this and say, well, there is a sort of secularism and the word secularism is very tricky because it has different meanings, but Dr. Sherman Jackson has called this the Islamic secular, and Ibn Khaldun actually is one of the people who had the insight enough to write deeply about this arrangement between the ulama and the governmental authorities. And notice I'm not saying state. I'm not using the word state, and I'm doing that for a reason, as I'll mention. So Ibn Khaldun described this arrangement, and he said many people say that this is not right and that the ulama should be involved in government. He said, but no, he said this is actually the appropriate arrangement, and he explained why that was. He explained why it was appropriate for during the era of the Khulafa Rashidun to have the ulama involved, and then after, like for example, there are many hadith or athar where Umar ibn Khattab and others were mentioned as having consulted with their council of qurra, Quran reciters and fuqaha and so on, that would frequent his home and so on, but he found that much less as time went on, and Ibn Khaldun explains that is actually appropriate. So one of the reasons for that, of course, is that the ulama did not want to have a stain of being involved with government, so that it would appear that they were corrupted, that they were being influenced by power, and they were very paranoid about that because of their taqwa and their desire to keep the ilm and the reputation of the Ahl al-Ilm unsullied by any relation to a close relationship to power. So there's that. Now, there's one reason when we fast forward to our time, the way that the state has swollen and has enlarged to the point that it has dominated nearly every aspect of our lives, that there is no coincidence that has happened as religion has receded. The state has begun to take to fill the gap that is left by religion as religion recedes, and the state often has a very important role in pushing religion away and filling up the gap that religion needs to fill to the role that religion used to play. So, for example, if you look at in the United States in 1850, Tocqueville, the French political science, was writing about his visit to the United States and said that there is no official religion in the United States, but it is the most powerful political institution in the country. Why? Because it's true that there is no official religion. There's no established religion, but religion played a huge role in morality, in charity, in and so on. I mean, it was essentially the underlying iceberg, and the tip of it was just in when it came to politics and when it came to government. I mean, the tip of it had no official religion, but underneath it, the iceberg was all religious, and very importantly as well, the government was much smaller then. The federal government was very small. State governments were very small, and most of society was dominated by religious institutions or other, maybe non-religious institutions, but nevertheless non-state institutions. So, it's also very important to understand that the American Revolution ended before the French Revolution started. The French Revolution was explicitly anti-religious. The American Revolution was explicitly religious. They were, in the sense that it was explicitly the explicit goal was to allow people to practice their religion without interference. So the goal, one of the major goals, and it's reflected in the fact that the First Amendment is the First Amendment, the amendment establishing the right to practice your religion without government interference, that this is the First Amendment to the Constitution. And So this was the aim of one of the main aims of the American Revolution. Whereas one of the major aim of the French Revolution was to annihilate religion and to put religion into a box and push it out of public life. So that's why it's when you hear, for example, in Quebec of them. The government wanting to impose a ban on religious symbols in public, for example. That's not from the American Revolution. That's not from the American understanding of leaving people, of keeping religion out of government for the purpose of allowing people to practice. That's from the French tradition of wanting to annihilate religion and wipe it clean, wipe the public sphere clean of any religion. So those are all important things. Now, when it comes to the Muslim world, and we hear people say, "Oh, we don't like these secular governments of Sisi," for example. Aside from the fact that Sisi is a tyrant, leave that aside. People say, "Well, they don't want secular regimes." You hear Muslims saying this. So, but what is meant by secular regimes, and what would and do we really? I mean, how would things be any better if these massive bureaucracies, massive security states were suddenly run by people who were claiming to be Muslim or thinking that they're Muslims, which is even worse. And now you've got this massive security state trying to, run around imposing Sharia, when in reality the actual traditional classical pre-modern Islamic polity was not a state, in the sense that it was not a all-encompassing Leviathan. It was, you know what I mean? So imagine an all-encompassing Leviathan that's running around looking to chop people's hands off. You get ISIS, for example. That's what you get. Or if you don't get something as rabid as ISIS, and without their takfiri deviance and so on, let's say you just get a bunch of activists who are politicians who are now in government, and they're trying to implement something like the Islamic penal punishments. I mean, this is not what the Prophet ﷺ intended. This is not what Allah intended. So we know the famous incident where Umar radiallahu anhu was walking down the street and heard some people partying or something, and jumped over the wall, and they told him, you're spying on us. It says in the Quran, "La tajassasu." So how do you "La tajassasu"? How do you implement "do not spy" in a country, in an environment its entire resources of the government are aimed at spying? And so anyway, I mean to say that this call for states that are not secular but that are Islamic is really just it's a false dichotomy. We have to look at reducing the size of government. We have to look at reducing the intrusion of government into people's lives, and at increasing the role of religion. The awqaf. Look at what these states did, for example, in the dying days of the Ottoman Empire, or in these new states that arose in its wake. Or the colonial states, for the colonial areas. They nationalized, seized the awqaf, seized the waqfs, which are the trusts that were non-state trusts, that were private trusts, that were that funded scholarship, that funded everything from water to charities and so on. These were all seized by the state. So there's an example right there of the state seizing these things. And so it's not going to help if you have people in power say, okay, we're Muslims and we control these, but the problem is, how do you structurally undo that? I was in Bosnia at a brother's house in Sarajevo, and he says, look, you see, we're on kind of like a little hill, and there was a very crowded neighborhood crowded with homes and stuff. And he says, you see all these homes around here on this hill? And I said, yeah. He says, these houses they all belonged to my great grandfather, but the communists, when they took power, they seized it all and they redistributed the land to these people. and so someone might say, we have now our academic brothers and sisters who are, enchanted by this idea that hierarchy is a bad thing, and so they would have said to the brother, "Oh no, but this is feudalism, and your great grandfather was an evil person that he owned all this land, and this is a good thing that this land was seized from him and redistributed to all these people." But in Islam, that's not permitted, So anyway, this is sort of a brief overview of. So the term secularism, and Charles Taylor, who you may know, wrote a book called The Secular Age. It took me 3 years to read this book, by the way, but a brilliant book on different types of secularism and what is meant by secularism. And so there's bad secular, and then there's, in the way that, for example, Sherman Jackson uses it, there's good secular in the sense of government not interfering and imposing its will on religion.
I wonder what your thoughts are on the kind of middle, not the middle ground, because they are both secular state, or they were secular states, or are, or have functioned as such since colonial era. On your thoughts on Egypt and Turkey, Egypt particularly during the time of the advent of the Muslim Brotherhood, where do they stand within this kind of dichotomy between the secular and the Islamic?
Egypt is just, Egypt is a perfect example of a swollen security state that seeks to control every aspect of its citizens' lives. I don't see much benefit at all in Islamizing. If you can't Islamize that, the only way to Islamize that is to reduce its size by probably 2/3. So I think the Muslim Brotherhood project is very misguided, because what they essentially seek to do is to seize the state, and I see the state as the problem. So I see it as something that is un-Islamizable. You can't be an Islamist in the sense that you want to Islamize something that is un-Islamizable.
Sorry, just to cut in there, do you think that Khomeini was able to achieve that, though, with Iran, to Islamize a state?
No, because this first, setting aside the fact that they're Shi'i, and it's sort of somewhat beside the point because they're not Sunni, and so I honestly think that really what's relevant for that type of situation is just whether or not people are treated justly or not. I don't think it makes a lot of sense to talk about their government being Islamic or non-Islamic. It's Islamic to the extent that they don't harm people and that they preserve the common good, and beyond that, their aqidah is wrong.
Obviously,
and
I agree. But
yeah, right. And I know you're not saying anything different.
If there were a Sunni state model, though, based on that, with a council of ulama,
okay,
what would that say then, hypothetically?
Right, and that's So all that being said, and obviously I mean that without any sort of ill will towards people who are Shiites. I definitely think that they're wrong in their beliefs, but I wish good for them, and and so on. So I don't mean any insult. I'm just speaking frankly as to what is true and what is false. But anyway, with Iran, first of all, we know that this arrangement that they came up with in Iran bears no resemblance whatsoever to anything that ever existed in Islamic history. Now, that in and of itself obviously is not something that would disqualify their political arrangement necessarily, because conditions change and so on. The question really is whether what you have come up with is compatible or within the parameters of what Allah wants for humans, so and for Muslims in particular. So the question is not, is this something that is different than what existed in before 1450 or something like that? That's not the question. I mean, I acknowledge and I accept, of course, that it is quite possible to, in these new circumstances, that we're in very different circumstances, that we're in a very different world order now than we were during the imperial order or the tribal order or feudal order and so on. So, so we recognize that, and we recognize that anyone who would endeavor to have the opportunity to set up or to establish a polity has a challenge ahead of them, which is to ensure that this is what they're doing is compatible with what Allah, the broad terms of what Allah sets down for what is and defines as good. So, looking at Iran, I mean, first of all, we know that Ali Shariati, who was the main ideologue behind the Iranian Revolution, based his ideas off of Rousseau and other French Enlightenment philosophers. And we know that Khomeini and it came up with this idea of wilayat al-faqih is not from our tradition, where and it's not even from Shiite tradition, by the way, that there's somehow some governmental council or council of ulama that reviews all legislation and so on as part of the government. And I just think that the problem in Iran is that the government is too big and the government is too involved in people's lives. And that's a very modern, very, very, very modern development. And it's this development, the development of the state, that is un-Islamic. The state, the size of the state and the power of the state and its involvement in people's lives and its displacement of traditional hierarchies, non-state hierarchies, such as religion, such as tribes, such as family, and so on. And its attempt to take over the role of parents and so on is un-Islamic, and Iran has not avoided that at all. They're very, very modern in that sense, and that's my problem with modernity, is really the intrusion of the Leviathan into the lives of people.
I think in terms of Iran specifically, I want to hone in, because Iran is actually a good case study, I guess, because you mentioned how I guess when it's a more of a Islamic rule and it's kind of encroaching on the personal lives of people who are living in that's the problem. But if you take if we start from maybe 1880s, you had the Qajar dynasty, and they were said to be from I guess from the feministic lens, they were encroaching upon how females should act. Apparently I read the recounts that it was just like everyone was wearing burqas and everyone was kind of forced to. And then you had that Constitution Revolution, and then you had a bit afterwards the Shah dynasty kind of came on board, but they went a complete U-turn in the sense, like complete reverse, in the sense that they were actually having police out there undressing people. Like it was kind of forced upon the people to be undressed, and anything that was seen as cultural, it wasn't limited to women's dress either. It was to condemning men who wore traditional clothes. They were forced to wear quote unquote secular clothing. A lot of it has to do with he wanted to secularize Iran and make it just like the West, all this sort of stuff. I think he had dialogues with the Turkish people at that time, because Turkish had their own secularization happening. And then the revolution happened because people were like, no, we don't want to be secularized. You know, we have a lifestyle, we have a culture, all that sort of reading of what it should be like to be Iranian. And then the revolution happened, and that's what we see today. But because you mentioned that in the time, like right now, how it's a Muslim country, just in quotation marks, but even when it was, I guess, secular, it was still encroaching on the lives of people, right? So would you say that you can pretty much linking like the Deen and Islam into, you can never really get a country or a nation to really be Islamic, because any other ism or ideology we take on board, it's always going to encroach on personal lives. But you're saying that Islamically it shouldn't be the case. So what's your sort of take on that?
Well, yeah. So I would say that, first of all, you can't. If you look at the life of the Prophet ﷺ and his da'wah, he did not set out just, enforcing things. He set out to inspire taqwa in people's hearts, and or piety or fear of God and God consciousness in the hearts of the people. And so once he had inspired this, and when this was in the hearts of the people, and then they began to, the very famous example of the Sahaba when the ayats came down forbidding alcohol, they went and overturned their jugs of alcohol in the streets so that the streets were flowing with wine. And it wasn't the police that went door to door dumping out people's wine. It was the people themselves that did that. And when you begin to lose taqwa in the hearts of people, then the state takes over. And that's why there's a feedback loop there where sometimes the state pushes the taqwa out of people's hearts so that they can take over, or on the other hand, when the fear of Allah, God, leaves people's hearts, then the state might have to take over. So as the state expands, there's a relationship there between the state and the fear of God in people's hearts, the fear of Allah. So what I would say obviously is that there's a very close relationship between someone like Ataturk going around and arresting people who were wearing the fez or something instead of a Western hat, and then on the other hand going around and arresting women who are not wearing hijab or something. And let me be very clear that I actually think that, look, I was just in a restaurant, the other day, this very famous sign on the door we have in America: no shoes, no shirt, no service. So isn't that a form of enforcing, a dress code? So where I can't just walk into the restaurant without a shirt on. They're going to tell me to get out, Or, for example, a woman can be arrested for walking around without a shirt. I don't want to say arrested, but yeah, probably could be arrested, but definitely fined or something for walking around without a shirt in my neighborhood or on the street. But I won't be if I'm walking around without a shirt. So there, it's enforcing women's clothing, but most people are in clothing in general. Or I could be arrested for walking around without any pants on. So the idea there is that there's the government, there's the society enforcing modesty. Now, I'm not against a law that would say that our society deems the hair to be something that must be covered, and so people need to cover it. But it's fruitless, and it becomes oppressive to have a law requiring that when the people don't see that as something that is important. They don't see that as something that they should be doing in their own hearts. So I just think it would be fruitless, for example, in the Amazon to suddenly, or somewhere like in the remote regions of like the pygmy tribes in Africa or something, to say, okay, well, suddenly we're having a law that everyone has to, all the women have to wear shirts. They would say, why? That's ridiculous. To do something like that, if that was what, I don't know, whatever, if that was someone's project for whatever reason, then you would have to introduce that as something that they wanted to do and as something that they saw and understood as good to cover in that way. So that's my take on that. I don't think that having a law about, there's nothing, it's very arbitrary to say that, I agree with a law that women shouldn't be running around without shirts, but I don't agree that women should, with a law that women shouldn't be wearing, that women could be arrested for, or I don't say arrested, but could be penalized for not wearing hijab. That's arbitrary. Why is a shirt good and a hijab is bad? That's someone who says that is simply basing their criterion on arbitrary cultural reasons. Unless they're basing it on a religious reason, which they'll never admit. And I don't think they could claim that a shirt is somehow religiously based, because people who do that claim to be secular. You see what I'm saying? So someone who says that has no actual ground to stand on when it comes to that. But that being said, I think that it's a big mistake for the law to focus on something like a hijab when the people are so far away from religion that they don't see it as something important. You have to, and that again is the role of the religious people in the inculcation of religion in the country, and the inculcation of taqwa. Because I don't want to run around where the only reason that I'm not robbed is because people are afraid of getting caught. I want to be able to walk I want to be able to walk the streets at night without fear of getting robbed, because people fear Allah, and so that's again replacing the state with the taqwa in the heart.
I wonder how this links to the point you made very briefly, kind of in passing before, about how Islamic education institutions in America, I think you were referring to specifically, are burning out students religiously. Yeah. This is kind of related, isn't it?
Yeah, it's very related because we're turning out, we're raising generations of Muslims that dislike Islam as a result of their experiences in Islamic schools. My daughter, one of my daughters, used to call her school the Quran slapping school, where she, if I had not been in prison at that time, I would have gone and slapped the teacher who was slapping her. So all of my kids went to, and I hope I'm not, exposing too much of their private lives. All of my kids grew up going to Islamic schools, and I can tell you that the extent to which, alhamdulillah, they have preserved their Islam is despite their experiences and not because of it. And I don't mean to cast aspersions and blame at the very well-intentioned people who are running these schools. But what I mean to say is that, and I also certainly don't mean to say that all Islamic schools are like this or are like this 100%, or maybe they're like, I don't know. But all I know is that we have Muslim students who are committing suicide. We have, it's a dire situation. I do not pretend to know why or what the solution is, because I have not looked into this matter enough. All I know is what I see from my children. As I mentioned, I was gone in prison for a very, very long time. All I know is that I came out and found that these Islamic schools are not doing the job that we want them to do, and students are coming out of these schools, going into colleges or not, with crises of faith. And we have to do, like my son told me that they never explained to him why he should be praying. They just told him, you have to pray, but they never explained to him, what is the meaning of this, and what is it just from what they reported to me as to what they were learning seemed to be something. It seemed to not be what I came to Islam for. What Islam, the beauty that I find in Islam, I found that they have not had explained to them, and not to mention, by the way, the fact that much of their academic work was very poor, and many of these, in the schools that they were going to. I was reviewing some of their work that they would, give me, and I was just, baffled at the low quality of it. So they're missing out on both angles. So I think Muslims in America need to really look at what other religious schools are doing in America, and what Islamic schools are doing outside of America to try to fix this situation. And I think this is a major contributor. But then likewise, so is going into public schools. I mean, you send your kids to public schools, then also they're coming out with a lot of problems, and you just hope that they will find their way back as they reach adulthood and as they have weighed everything, and hopefully come to realize that the tradition that they were raised in is the truth. I don't know how to solve this problem.
Because I've had these discussions a lot with a lot of close friends of mine. We had like an Islamist phase. Like, we kind of agree with elements, but we don't find it's the solution per se. And then we go to a different extreme of like pure Sufism. You know what I mean?
Right.
So then it's hard to navigate. So you kind of encounter reality. You read a bit of history as well. You're thinking how, like, there's all these different sort of issues and events in the past that have occurred. How do we make sense of today's day and age? And me personally, I agree with a lot what you said. Unfortunately, with the Muslim institutions, we're just not up to the mark. And one of the reasons, or one of my own personal theories, is that because a lot of the West wasn't, Muslim until, Muslims like sort of immigrated from the Eastern lands, came here, did dawah, or just joined with the society, and people encountered Islam, and conversions happened, all this sort of stuff. So we can say that, I
By
guess.
the way,
Yes, sir.
not to interject, but that's not exactly what happened when it came to African Americans, though. By the way, African Americans kind of found it through other means. But anyway, yeah.
Okay, yeah, because I was speaking more from my Sydney Australian context.
Yes.
I'm not too familiar, but yeah, definitely with the African American, it's a lot different dynamics. But for us personally here, it's more imported from India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Lebanon, all those sort of places. So like my parents were pretty much in that generation. So when people from that generation came over here, they set up the institutions, and I would say, not to kind of put them all under the same brush, but they weren't cognizant of the real realities on the ground in the West. I guess they sort of stuck in their own bubbles of culture. Like, for example, my parents like to hang with the Bangladesh community. So they only think that it's no different from them living in Bangladesh now, because the way they speak, the way they don't even engage with current affairs in locally in Australia, they actually follow the Bangladesh news more. You know what I mean? So they're only in their own little spaces, and that becomes problematic because they're not aware of the wider society, what's actually going on. Like, for example, I was talking to my mom, and I was telling her, like, Mom, you have no idea like how prevalent XYZ issue is amongst the youth here in Sydney, amongst the Muslim community, and she's baffled. I'm like, how can you be baffled? You're like older than me. You've been living here longer. But it's because they're in their own bubble, if that makes sense. So when that happens, and when the institutions or the Muslim institutions are being set up, it's not catering for the current society. So these ideas like, I don't know, secularism, people aren't aware what they are, liberalism, how to encounter these sort of issues, and how to navigate them as well, how to think. Even Aqidah, no one actually understands. Like, I don't think, like, as you mentioned, like, people just are being told to pray, but they don't actually know who's Allah, who's Rasul Sallallahu, why Islam's the truth. Like, these deeper theological things.
Exactly.
It's only very surface level, just rules and regulations, and it becomes problematic. Right. It's like, why are you following this? This is cultural. Like, I have more fun doing other stuff. Why do I need to follow this? So it's not really broken down on an institutional level when they enter these institutions. That's why a good example is, I remember I think it was like an Islamic class, and there was a bunch of like older generation people, like 16 years old, 15 years old, and if they're doing like a kind of a Sira exam, and I think one of the Sira questions was about the Sira was, who was the companion of Rasul Sallallahu? Is it Abu Jahl, Abu? You know what I mean? Like, these are the sort of questions you're gonna get when you're in, like, as a teenager. Like, that shows like where we are, I guess, intellectually when it comes to grappling and engaging with the deen, and from a theological basis, because we know atheism is rife. And how people are going to be lost because it seems fancy when they bring out these philosophy, and it sounds smart, and they intertwine it with science, but they don't know how to navigate it. So I guess on an institutional level, when you have like cultural people from other lands, like from older generations, that not like, I'm not condemning them, I'm just saying that they just weren't cognizant of the current society that we're living in, that becomes that is embodied on an institutional level, and that's why you churn out sort of Muslims that are around my age that are actually lost with the deen. So that's why education becomes really important, and engaging with the society and all the isms that come with it.
Also, just to mention on a point that you were talking about, perspectives of the Muslim community, my parents still see Islam as like a very ethnic, distinctly ethnic phenomenon. That it's like part of the Orient, like they come from, they're educated, and they come from, quite a progressive background.
I just want to apologize for all this chaos that's going on behind me. I have a very, very sophisticated microphone, and it's picking up all this, and I can't even get over there and tell them to be quiet. So everyone's just going to have to be party to this conversation that's going on behind me. Go ahead. I mean, it's in another room, but anyway, go ahead.
No, that's no problem. Yeah, no, my family still have this very... it's a very defined idea of Islam, as even though their son, who's a generation below them, is Muslim, they still see it as a very ethnic phenomenon, and there's never any kind of serious consideration amongst mainstream society. There can't be, and I don't blame them for it, of Islam as a viable like a viable answer to life's questions and the truth behind reality. They would never consider it as such, because every single engagement they have with Muslims might be like small business owners when they go to get their Lebanese bread, and like whenever they see it on the news, it's always, accompanied with like whenever there's a story about Muslims, it's always accompanied with like a flute, like a Middle Eastern instrument playing in the background, like a oud or something in the background, and they're like, "Oh, this is the Muslims, this is the ethnic religion." But I wonder, obviously, I think it would be a bit different in America, but I think just
no, very similar to what you're saying.
Linking it to what Tanzim's saying, like there needs to be. I mean, obviously, we've got the media is probably safe to say is like, quote unquote against us. They want to they're happy to portray negative stereotypes because it fits the agendas of those who control the media. However, the point I'm more saying is that there needs to be a concerted effort, despite this, from Muslims to really emphasize the intellectual points behind the religion, and there needs to be an education of young Muslims, particularly those who to use the term we discussed earlier, native or indigenous to the West, to be. But
Liz, I hate to say this, I want to just make some closing remarks because my wife actually has to also jump on a podcast. So I'm really sorry to cut this short, but on the other hand, sometimes if a conversation is going really, really well and you end it at a beautiful and interesting time, then that's often better than a conversation that peters out and should have ended a long time ago. So.
Nah, it's all good. We have to head off anyway, but that was definitely interesting thoughts. Yeah, sorry, what were you saying?
I just want to say that I think as far as that, I think you've really hit the nail on the head. I mean, what it is that the older generation doesn't understand the what their children are going through, and they therefore are not able to equip them with with what would help them defend their iman, and I don't like the word defend as much as preserve their iman in the face of of everything, the environment around them that is working so hard to erode that faith. And so we have to give our children the ability to hold on to that hot coal that is iman, that the Prophet ﷺ said would be the case, and these older people, they're not equipped to explain how are they going to defend their beliefs and preserve their beliefs in the face of these things. So with that, brothers, I'm going to have to let you go, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to have been a guest on your show, and which is really, really one of the most interesting and listenable podcasts out there.
For the kind words. We always follow you on Twitter. I wanted to quickly add before you go, just the idea, I think also to take a bit deeper, is also family. I found that Muslim families here locally in Sydney are like the most dysfunctional. So that's why parents can't communicate with the kids. Kids are sitting behind their backs because they're too scared to talk to their parents. These weird dynamics. If parents and children are like tight, then the kids can actually be open to the parents and be like, I have these issues I need to navigate through because I'm suffering, and I'm Muslim in this lands or whatever, and they can help them through that. So that's also that different layer as well. But that's something I
instead of just yelling at them, judging them, whatever, we have to be able to listen to them. That's absolutely right.
Exactly.
Okay, Juan, thank you so much. And my wife is upset with me, but
apologies. So you can hop off now. Jazakallah khair for coming on. I'm just going to sign off now, inshallah.
Barakallah feekum. And jazakumullah khair to the listeners who are listening. I hope it was beneficial, inshallah. Sallallahu ala nabiyyina Muhammad.
Inshallah. So for our listeners, thank you for giving us your attention. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to email us at info@boysinthecave.com or find us on Facebook, and you can follow our journey through Instagram. Please leave a 5-star rating on iTunes. That greatly helps us. So from our special guest Ismail Royer, Rafael, and myself, we wish you all the best. This is Tanzim signing off. Assalamu alaikum.